uh, which I think gives me a little bit different lens than some of the other folks that have been joining us for these talks. I always like to kind of remind us that the histories that we've learned in K-12 in many ways are origin stories that are intended to build civic identity, making how we teach history very political. I actually have a cover here from one of the textbooks that we've used on our campus that is literally called Origins. You know, we also have this quote: the first thing a colonizer does is, with a perverted sense, turn to the past of a colonized people and distort, disfigure, and destroy it. You know, there are a number of what I call interlocking, enabling narratives that underpin the view of history that we're taught. And one of the most fundamental of those is the wilderness. I know in sustainability, we're often taught that what we want to do is have something that is pristine and untouched. But I'm going to challenge that and say rather what we want is landscapes in which relationships between all beings in that landscape are fundamental to how we move forward within it. Right now, the context of Western society is that nature is a thing, and the beings in nature are things, rather than recognizing them with a personhood status of their own. I'm saying this because North America was a very lived landscape. There were not untouched wildernesses. The perception of untouched wilderness is a recognition of the incredible productivity and success of the land and its resources under the stewardship of Indigenous people. So just quickly, I wanted to put up a map showing North American Indigenous peoples. These maps are far from complete, but bottom line, there is not a place that is not occupied anywhere in this continent. The other piece is that populations are often lowballed. The North American population prior to 1492 for much of the 20th century was thought to be maybe 1 million people. But we've now had a number of statistical studies that have been done based on depopulation ratios, looking at various disease events. And now most conservative theories suggest that 50 to 100 million inhabitants were in the Americas prior to 1492. So when I talk about this being a very lived landscape, we had at least 550 distinct societies, conservatively 16 different language families with more than 1,000 dialects. And so all of this more or less takes us to a place where we need to understand the relationships that Indigenous people established with the land. Indigenous people are also often portrayed, first of all, as hunters, and second, as randomly wandering hunters. When the reality is that instead, our agriculture was simply going to the resource rather than terraforming a particular piece of land to force it to produce what we wanted it to. So for an Anishinaabe community, as you noted, Anishinaabe is a community I come from. An Anishinaabe community anywhere throughout the Great Lakes and here into Manitoba would have consisted of a group of families that had a specific territory, usually roughly 20 miles by 20 miles, that supported several camps over the course of the year. So the first one in the spring would be the sugar bush, when the maple syrup, when the maple sap started running in the sugar maple trees. And this would be collected and boiled down into granulated sugar. We today often think of the final product as maple syrup. Maple syrup, however, is not very preservable. We have to keep it in a refrigerator. If we take it all the way down to the granulated sugar place, it's much more preservable and usable throughout the year. And so this process, and you'll see up here in our sugar camp, these are primarily women who are engaged in the work of boiling down the sugar. We're also seeing, as spring arrives, the start of the fishing runs, and I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the things that sometimes we talk about in ceremony is sweet water, is the sap before it's boiled down. So there are also very important ceremonial uses of the maple sap and the maple sugar. This is not the only tree that we tapped for use of its sap. We also tapped the birch trees. So when we think about the water that Indigenous people are accessing, it's not just the water that is traveling through our lakes and streams, it's also the water that is supporting our trees. Down here at the bottom, you have a first feast ceremony. When we made the maple sugar, this was kind of the start of the renewal. It was the first new agricultural products that come in that year. Whenever we harvested, the first of that harvest was given to Spirit in thanks for making sure that we were able to harvest again. So this family is gathered. They've got a bowl full of sugar cakes. They've got some fry bread, some fried fish, maybe some berries over here. But you've got a meal here, and the first plate with a bite from each of these dishes would be put into the fire or put out into the woods. And so it's this relationship, it's recognizing, even as we're tapping these trees, that they are not a disinterested resource, but that the spirit of each one of those beings is being asked for permission to tap it, and is in granting that permission, agreeing to help support us. One of our traditional stories talks about how human beings were the last created and the last to receive their gifts from the Creator. And by the time he got to us, he'd given out all of the great, wonderful gifts, whether that be sharp claws or a big bushy tail or bark or whatever it may be. And so the other beings in creation agree to help us, as long as we continue to treat them with respect. So respect is a big piece of this. There's a whole process around a large tree can be tapped up to 3 times, but it should only be tapped for up to about 5 years before those trees are left to kind of re-strengthen and rejuvenate and are circled back to. So there's an entire process of sustainability within this process of harvesting the maple sugar, which of course ultimately does not impact the ability of these trees to continue to grow. We would leave a shed in the sugar bush area with the implements that we use to engage in sugar bush. So this particular shed has a birch bark covering, and probably etched in this birch bark would be the clan naming symbols of the people who came and regularly used this sugar bush. Sugaring was done for the purpose not only of sustaining ourselves, but also for trade. It was used prior to 1492 as part of the indigenous trade networks. After 1492, it was certainly highly prized by the fur traders who came. And in fact, in the early 19th century, when abolition becomes a major topic of concern in the East, Because regular white cane sugar is what had been processed by slaves, there was an interest in acquiring maple sugar to the point that, we're finding records of tens of thousands of pounds of maple sugar in excess of what communities are keeping for their own use, being traded to the fur trade companies who are shipping it back east for purchase there. So the birch bark that we build our lodges or our sheds with, that we make canoes with, that we make containers with, is also a renewable resource. This is actually me harvesting this birch bark, some so long ago that I don't want to admit to it at this point. But the point being, when I take this bark, it is not all of the bark. This is a paper birch tree. It will actually naturally shed some of its bark every year, but you carefully just cut a line with a knife, but you don't go through all of the layers of the bark, and then you just can easily peel it off around the outside of the tree, and that tree will not die. That tree will continue to grow, although this portion where I've harvested the bark will darken. So that bark can be used for a long period of time. You can see here in this lodge that the women are in front of, they've sewn sticks or wood slats onto the edge of it in order to keep it from cracking and kind of rolling back. That will increase the longevity of this lodge covering and mean that when we move from camp to camp, these women are able to just roll up those sheets of bark into bundles that they can carry. While bulky, birch bark is incredibly lightweight and easy to carry. And actually, it's been tested for its insulative value, for its thickness, which usually would have been about a quarter of an inch. A quarter of an inch of this birch bark is better than a quarter of an inch of the kinds of insulation that we use today. So as we would move into the summer, we would have a period in which we would plant our crops. On the left-hand side here, we can see this grandmother from northern Minnesota with the corn that she's getting ready to hang up to dry. On the right hand is an image of raised garden beds from Potawatomi territories along the Great Lakes. And the image, that's the sort of drawing there, is actually from an archaeological study of this particular field area. You can see from the size of the human beings how extensive this is. Precisely because the fur trade has kind of dominated the historical narrative. It's what white folks were interested in. It's what white folks were profiting from. It obfuscates the existence of our very extensive indigenous agriculture. And this agriculture, certainly is supporting not only us, is used in the trade. And in fact, the fur traders who are bringing goods a long distance from Montreal back to their posts here in the West, and from there trading with indigenous people, they don't have room in those canoes to bring all of the supplies that would support them over the year. They are purchasing the majority of their food from indigenous people. And once again, like with the sugar, it is women who are creating these raised beds, who are planting the crops and who are harvesting them. So in all of these cases, that makes the food products, these agricultural food products, property of the women. And we can see in the fur trade exchanges that there are, fur traders who are very frustrated because the women will not trade and allow them to count the food against their husband's debts. These women say, I don't know what agreement you have with my husband. It has nothing to do with what I would like you to pay for my food. And if you would like this food, you're going to trade me goods for it. The fur traders needed the food badly enough that they did exactly that, but they complain about it. And analyses of fur trade diaries has revealed that as many as a third of the trades recorded in the books are trades with Indigenous women for food. In our gardens, you often hear about the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, being grown together, the corn going in the center of the raised bed, the green, the beans planted in a circle around the corn so they can grow up the corn stalk like a trellis. And then kind of out on the outer edges would be the squash with huge leaves that then shade in these areas and help keep the moisture in for these crops. So here are some very early images of Indigenous communities. Hochelaga was home to about 1,500 to 2,000 people living in 50 longhouses and was surrounded by cornfields. You can see even in the drawing here, very significant stands of corn and fields of other crops in the background. So these crops are in evidence when Europeans arrive. We even have French records that talk about, in the peninsula of Lower Ontario, that the cornfields were so vast that you could ride a horse from sunrise to sunset and not reach the end of them. This is significant agricultural production. But when we talk about North America as a wilderness, when we frame North America as sort of the state of nature from which communities form, as they do throughout the social contract theorists in their writings, it erases this agricultural activity, this use of the waters to support these plants and support these food products. And not only that, but many of our cities and towns are on top of the towns and cities from which Indigenous people were displaced in order to create the reserves on which they now live. This means that the areas that they originally used for agricultural productivity were quickly acquired by Europeans, who certainly preferred taking over an already cleared field from acquiring an area from which they had to either remove stone or remove trees and stumps in order to create a field. We also collected a lot of medicines for our health. In this particular example, I have a whole picture of a field of bergamot. This is from the Oneida Nation farms in Wisconsin. They have a tea shop alongside their gas station that has a lot of medicinal teas. And so this is something that they grow and they share with their community, but also beyond their community. When Indigenous people were removed to reserve areas, they often brought the seeds for these medicines with them. So not just the food seeds, but the medicines as well. Okay. The wild rice is one that uses the waters more directly. It's a marsh plant. It will grow in small, relatively still lakes, as well as along the edges of slow-moving rivers. The wild rice was an incredible resource for Indigenous people, as well as for bird life throughout this region. For Indigenous people, we used to actually bind the rice, as you can see in the picture on the left here. The bindings actually would have a pattern in them that often related to a particular family, so you knew where particular families were going to harvest. So you would have families coming together along the shores to go out in these lakes You can see the big picture here that sort of looks like a meadow, but it's actually a wild rice lake with two canoes moving through it, harvesting that rice. Once the canoes come back in, there's a whole process involved in threshing that rice. You have to parch it over a very low heat to dry out the remaining moisture that's in the rice. Then you have a process known as dancing on it to loosen the hulls. And then a basket like this is used to shake the rice and to let those hulls kind of blow away in the air. The rice then preserved will last for a very long time. Some say indefinitely. And the rice itself is one of the most healthy grains in the world for human consumption. This is traded and it's used extensively for subsistence by fur traders. Alexander Henry the Younger, as he was coming through in the 1760s, met with a community in which he traded first with the men for their furs, but then the men withdrew, the women came forward with their bags of rice, and he talked about purchasing 100 bags equal to a bushel each from the women of just one Anishinaabe community. So the productivity here again is exceptionally high. Because the birds are very interested in this rice, this was also an opportunity for the men to stay nearby and hunt waterfowl while the women are harvesting the rice. This is actually a drawing from the diary of a missionary of a community and how it's laid out along the waters back in 1835. This particular community is in northern Minnesota. It's known as Fond du Lac, and it's essentially near what would be Duluth today. So you have this river coming through here. You have rapids up here, which are often a really excellent location for harvesting different types of fish, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Out here on these islands, you have on one island the village. You have a huge section that's identified as prairie, which is probably full of those tall grass prairie medicines that we talked about earlier. And then the Indian gardens, which would be the corn, beans, squash, and other agricultural produce. In doing so, they're taking advantage of the microclimate created by the water, so that these areas will have a longer frost-free period, and the corn will more likely reach its germination. But also the various channels of this river are going to create some areas that are more slow moving than others and have some wild rice beds. Back here, we see the stable and the mission identified. Over here, we have the fur trader posts. And then up here are elm, birch, and maple tree resources. So we can see this region as very important and very central to the life of the community and the way that they are using water both as something that produces a food resource, but also that is maintaining a microclimate for their production of other food sources. So fishing. Fishing is something that we would engage in perhaps on the scale of aquaculture. We built extensive fishing weirs and fishing traps to capture fish during spawning. The picture on the right here is from, I believe, 1585. And then over on the left is simply an artist's rendering of what some of these weirs would look like. We also see weirs in the black and white picture, huge sort of barriers, as well as you've actually got a fish ladder that they've created so that the fish are tracked through a specific part of that, making it easier for them to spear the fish. And the fishing runs would start in February and go all the way through fall with different populations of fish coming through at different times of the year. When I lived in Upper Michigan, we would start with the smelt runs in late February and move forward until the whitefish spawning in the fall. There's also a lot of records of the spearing of lake sturgeon. And lake sturgeon would be fish in the area of 70 to 80 pounds each. So the amount of fish resources, both in terms of dried food, but also rarefied fish oil, were very significant. And again, both for subsistence, but also for engaging in the trade. So this is actually an underwater archaeology site, Mekanging, the place of the fish fence. This is in Ontario, and the site is believed to have been in use for more than 5,000 years. And so I pulled this particular quote from an individual, one of the observers of the historical era. A humongous number of our fish are called together there, various species going through at different times. The perch come through, the suckers come through, the pickerel come through, the pike come through, the bass. It's like they each have their own little window of opportunity, and they scoot through the narrows, going from the deep water of Simcoe and the rest of the Trent up into the shallower lake area of Couchiching. There's lots of different names for this lake. So it gives you kind of a sense of that use. Here's some that are closer to home for those of us who are in Winnipeg. These are Roseau River fishing weirs. On the left, you have images of them built from wood in 1858. The one on the right is the remains of a stone fishing weir. And so when we think about, the role of fish, it really changes how we perhaps understand the peoples of this place. When we look at the plains, archaeological sites contain more fish bones than buffalo bones. When we, think about why that isn't our go-to, why we always emphasize the bison, European arrival significantly changed these landscapes. Europeans very quickly, removed weirs that they considered in the more as barriers to their forms of trade and watercraft. But also we see a significant silting of rivers with agriculture and hydroelectric power that results in significant depletion of these fisheries and obscures the fact that the prairie and parkland region were once vastly abundant in fish resources. In the woodlands, the timber industry also is causing significant silting and destruction of weirs because they're using the rivers to actually move the timber from where it's cut down to the sawmills. In the process, these logs often lose a lot of their bark, which similarly becomes debris in the rivers. This is going to impact wild rice, which needs a very specific thick mud composition along the bottom of the river, as well as impacting the ability to engage in fishing. So an ample supply of fish certainly enabled fairly large groups to gather in seasons when they otherwise would have had to disperse over the countryside. So that fish added to, not only added to their subsistence, but also expanded the size of camps and enlarged social opportunities. So one place that we can point to is Sault Ste. Marie. Sault Ste. Marie is described as having a population of as many as 800 year-round. Because the rapids of St. Mary's did not freeze because of the amount of water that was flowing through it from Lake Superior down into the Huron and Michigan systems. Today, that's a little bit different because of the construction of the locks. But during the summer months prior to the industrial period, when those rapids were there, the population, the indigenous population of Sault Ste. Marie would swell to as many as 1,000 people. At Red River, even in the Métis period, we see the construction of ribbon lots, which are long, thin lots, ensuring that every family has river access and therefore access to fishing and the ability to subsist in that way. So this is a quote from Provincial Overseer Gunn in 1870. And he says, in former years, these fish were numerous in the river, and no doubt some thousands have been taken. It appears that those who defined the limits of this province, Manitoba, did not feel disposed to include much lake area within the above boundaries. Notwithstanding that, our fishermen, since the transfer, go to their old fishing grounds a few miles north of the northeast corner of the province. At the latter end of September, numbers of fishermen leave Red River for Lake Winnipeg, some in birch canoes, others in skiffs, all endeavor to get where they intend to fish by the 6th or the very latest by the 10th of October. A few of them try their own fortune within the province, others pass to the southeast corner of the lake. Part of them remain on Elk Island, and the rest pitch their tents around the bay into which the River Winnipeg empties its waters. Some proceed as far north as the Blackwater River. The fishermen endeavor to be there at the scene of their operations before the fish come to the shore, which is generally from the 1st to the 10th of October. About 5,000 may be taken as the average yearly catch of this valuable fish in that portion of our Great Lake, which is within the province, and we may safely admit that the numbers taken annually near the mouth of the Red and Winnipeg rivers do not fall short from 70 to 80,000. So I want you to think about the size of that fishery resource. This is a resource that was being harvested on a sustainability basis, and when we think about the impacts of things like hydro is impacting the water itself, but it's also impacting the fish that live in that water. And at Fisher River, I've had some of their community members speak in my classes about the impact of hydro. And they speak to the fact that prior to the hydro project, most of the families in the community survived as commercial fishermen. But once hydro came in and destroyed the fisheries with the amount of silt from annual flooding that would come through, none of them are able any longer to subsist by fishing, and are now able, or not just subsist, but from commercial fishing, and now are dependent on federal assistance. When they were commercial fishermen, when they were able to engage in that livelihood, they were making something on the order of $50,000 to $60,000 a year.
Hi, Carrie. This is a 2-minute warning.
Okay. So, and I will admit, I thought I had longer than a half an hour. So this was a section just to sort of talk about the variety of vehicles and the incredible technology that went into that. But I want to skip ahead and say something a bit more about trade. And these are maps of indigenous trade routes that existed prior to and subsequent to European arrival. The maps indicate, you can see from the routes how dependent they were on the rivers, and how watercraft were absolutely our way of traversing this vast continent. I want to point out that for Indigenous people, the waters that were within their territories were perceived as part of that community's resources. So that there is a complex process of asking permission if one is going to harvest or use that resource in any particular way. And there are a number of conflicts that erupt with European fur traders, precisely because they view waters as sort of spaces of international commerce as not belonging to Indigenous people. And so in particular for the French, they had a major colony that was connected with the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, and another major colony on the Mississippi River with headquarters at New Orleans. They're connected by what's called the Fox-Wisconsin waterway that flows from Green Bay to Prairie du Chien on the Fox and Wisconsin river system, with only one portage between them. And as traders tried to begin moving goods along that route to trade with the Dakota and Dakota allied peoples on the west side of the Mississippi, their former allies in this region became very upset and began to block their access to that water route. Basically saying, we're not going to allow you to trade weapons with our enemies that are going to be used against us. That's not what a good friend and relative does. And these fur traders essentially responded, this is a free space, it's open to everyone, and this resulted in conflict. So that's one small example. The bottom line is Indigenous people were absolutely aware of their resources. They were aware how much they needed for their own use. They were aware of how much they could put forward for trade. And these were managed as relationships, that in ways that were very sustainable. I guess I'm sort of out of time here. So perhaps at this point, I can take some questions.
Thank you. I'm just going to stop the recording.